Well, welcome to the penultimate lecture in the series. Today, as promised, we're going to be taking a look at ISIS, the Islamic State, that has faded from spectacular view, but is still very, very much present as a key player in the insurgencies and the jihadist rebellions of the world. We'll be having a look at the brief history of ISIS and analogous organizations and ponder what it was that they tried to accomplish and what notions or concepts of justice were inherent or at least claimed in the rebellions, the insurgencies, and indeed the atrocities that they committed in the name of God and justice. Now, I have put upon the BLE 5 years ago, 2015, an earlier film about my views on ISIS for this course. I decided to leave that film on the BLE page because it provides, to a certain extent, a contrast with some of the things that I want to say now. Wisdom in hindsight, perhaps, but of course nobody could have told at that point in time exactly the progress of ISIS. And even the book that I wrote, Spear to the West, that was written pretty much at the height of the territorial conquests of ISIS, when they occupied great cities, particularly in Iraq. And when it seemed that the full frontal assault that both the regional powers and the West were urging would come to nothing. It was at that point in time, it was really a caliphate in the making as a geopolitical entity, a new kind of state in the world system, which had turned to secular statehood after the Treaty of Westphalia in the 1700s. So it was a disruption not only to the peace of the region, which was hardly actually at peace anyway, but it was a disruption and a challenge to the international state system. And in particular, it was a challenge to the idea of secularity. In other words, the carving out of a zone, a geographical zone, with a political system based on a theology. And not even a theology that was in some way analogous in Sunni terms to what had been attempted in Iran, in Shia terms, the antecedent thought that someone like Shariati brought to the Iranian Revolution seemed to be absent in what ISIS was trying to do. It seemed at first glance to be a medieval throwback. And this rather lazy and casual use of terms was in some ways deliberate. I remember talking to policymakers in the United States, in Washington, D.C., round about that time, after ISIS had burst onto the scene in 2014. And in 2014, they were saying, oh my goodness, do we have to take this group seriously? We were just beginning to get to grips with intelligence on Al Qaeda. And is that all now going to go to waste? Is Al Qaeda going to be superseded by ISIS? Do we have to start again and try to understand this organization, what it stands for? Really, it was only in 2015 that the first full-length article appeared not in the academic press, but in the, as it were, technical intellectual press in the Atlantic magazine, attempting to give some kind of at least sketch as to what ISIS was trying to do, and very much in sketch terms, what it might stand for. And that's pretty much why I decided to write the book, Spear to the West. It came out last year, but these things take a time after going to press actually to appear. And as I said, I wrote it when it was at its height. Now, in achieving its height, they were pretty much disposing in 2015 of a budget of roughly 1 billion US dollars, an annual budget of 1 billion US dollars. They were able to deploy 30,000 fighters, and more to the point, they were able to deploy these fighters in new strategic formations, Now, they were new insofar as it took Western-trained armies, by that I mean primarily the Iraqi armed forces, took them by surprise, trained along Western lines. In fact, these kinds of strategic methodologies had been pioneered by Colonel Gaddafi, for instance, in the wars in Chad in the 1980s. They had been used by the Taliban in the conquest of Kabul at the beginning of the reign of the Taliban in Afghanistan. But it was the first time that a Western trained army had been confronted by mobile warfare using Toyota pickups for the most part, and I'll describe these pickups in a few minutes, and able to achieve huge maneuverability. So, as well as being extremely well financed and extremely well equipped, hundreds upon hundreds, fleets of these Toyota pickups, all in uniform colors and all equipped in a uniform fashion. They were able to deploy these and the 30,000 fighters in formations that basically follow a mechanized version of what the Prussian general who confronted Napoleon, Karl von Clausewitz, described in his seminal work on war, and that is the ability to concentrate your forces at the enemy's weakest point, concentrate your forces faster than he can gather his defenses together, and break through faster than the enemy can envisage, plan for, cope with. And that was exactly what happened in Iraq, to a certain extent in Syria, and it led, of course, to the announcement of a caliphate. And it was the announcement of a caliphate deliberately because of a quarrel within Al Qaeda in Syria, where there was a division as to whether or not the Al Qaeda fight, particularly as articulated by the Al Nusra faction of Al Qaeda, should concentrate on defeating the government of Syria, or whether it should, to at least some extent, continue the original vision of people like Osama bin Laden, and that is to have jihad against the Western apostate world. The struggle of ISIS was to carve out the caliphate in situ, on location, to build, as it were, a headquarters that could later emanate outwards, but to concentrate resources, first of all, on a center of militant jihad Islam that all the same claimed intellectual roots. And I want to describe some of these roots, but let me first continue my discussion about the equipment of the ISIS armed forces. Brilliantly deployed, therefore brilliantly generaled, and all of these Toyota pickups, and no trace to this day has been found, purportedly, on how so many vehicles got to the battle zones of Iraq and Syria. No shipping documents have come to light, apparently. And more to the point, no trace of records as to how each of these vehicles was bespoke along uniform lines, mounted with Browning machine guns. Now, any of you who have, in your university vacations, used a hydraulic drill on building sites, um, and you can feel the vibration of the drill through your shoulders and upper back, you've got to imagine what it's like to hold the hydraulic drill parallel to the ground against a wall. You're trying to demolish a wall rather than the footpath underneath you. Well, that's what trying to handle a Browning machine gun feels like. The kickback is ferocious. So if you try to mount a Browning machine gun on the ordinary tray of a Toyota pickup, it's going to rip out the tray. So what had to happen was that every single one of the several hundred Toyota Hilux pickups that were used by ISIS had their Browning machine guns mounted by drilling down to the chassis, attaching the machine guns to the chassis. Now, that again is a formidable engineering feat, a logistical feat, a feat that took time, it needed location, it needed plans, and again, nothing has been discovered. So the sourcing of all of this, the financing of all of this, the covert training of all of this, the basic planning of a brilliant military campaign, all of this seems to be without trace in terms of the public knowledge, at least, of the intelligence agencies of the Western world. This raises suspicions, of course, and it's very, very difficult not to break into conspiracy theories. There is, however, some circumstantial evidence which suggests that private funding from countries like Saudi Arabia is at work here. And what you do in tracing back a certain genealogy of permission for private, quote-unquote, sources in Saudi Arabia to be involved with international jihad by way of providing monies, we trace back to the 1979 siege of Mecca. Now, this was an infamous siege. It was led by noble people, high connections, high families, who were acolytes of the Wahhabi sect of Islam. Now, this is, for want of another analogy, something like an equivalent of Christian Puritanism, stark, ascetic, but also claiming purity, and also claiming that the House of Saud had departed from the ascetic ways of true Islam and had been corrupted by opulence. And this opulence was manifest in the way that the Saudi family lived. It was apparent in the great cities, even in the holy city of Mecca. And it was a return to the asceticism, the sparse desert, as it were, way of thinking, using the desert as a metaphor for the purity, the uncontamination of the original Islam that drew people towards the banner of rebellion. Now, in fact, the House of Saud and the Wahhabi sect had had a long and a very, very volatile, vicious, and atrocious history, in which each side basically took turns slaughtering the other. But at the very beginning of the foundation of Saudi Arabia, this is going back a couple of centuries, basically the progenitors of both the Wahhabi sect and the House of Saud rode out of the desert together and formed together the prototypical Saudi state, which of course went through many variations before its formation after World War I in its modern guise. So Wahhabism never went away, and the tension in Saudi Arabia between opulence on the one hand and this ascetic sense of what Islam should be lingered behind the scenes. Now, bear in mind that when Saudi Arabia became independent after World War I, it was the poorest country on earth, or at least one of the poorest countries on earth. It was only when oil was discovered in 1938 that suddenly the fortunes of the country were transformed. And at the same time, a certain pragmatism arose in the observance of Islam, letting in, as it were, material benefits, letting in on holy soil Western engineers, Western oil prospectors, Western gas companies. All of that kind of thing offended many people. So that the siege of Mecca in 1979 literally was a siege that was occasioned by the insurgents seizing the mosque in Mecca and holding thousands and thousands of pilgrims and worshippers hostage. Wave after wave of Saudi troops could not dislodge them. The siege had been well planned. They knew the underground network that lay underneath the holy mosque. They knew how these underground tunnels led to the minarets. They set up snipers' nests in all the minarets. They commanded the underground, they commanded the above ground, and they were able to slaughter those who tried to attack them on ground, and at the same time used as hostages all of those who had come to worship. Basically, nothing that the Saudi forces could do worked. Now, in the end, and this is the stuff of legend and rumor, we don't know exactly, who did what. Some say it was French forces who ceremonially converted to Islam, certainly as a formality so they could set foot on the holy place. Foreign legionnaires, basically, who dislodged the insurgents. Some say it was Pakistani commandos, and they would have been Islamic in any case. And some say the American CIA, with its obvious interests in Saudi Arabia on behalf of the United States and its petroleum and strategic interests. We don't really know, but the insurgents were either slaughtered or captured. Those captured were publicly executed, but it is thought that behind the scenes the House of Saud knew that it had to come to some kind of accommodation with the Wahhabi clerical underground, as it were, that is very close in any case to the above ground of Saudi everyday life. And the arrangement seems to be that it would be Wahhabi doctrine that would influence social relations in Saudi Arabia, thus the hard line on women, for instance, thus the kind of education in primary schools, so that when ISIS conquered Mosul, they simply used Saudi textbooks in their primary schools. They were perfectly suited. But also, apart from that very stringent control of domestic social policy, that they would also have a behind-the-scenes, unfettered influence on international policy, disseminating Islam both by educational means and by financial means, and also by means of encouraging rebellion. So with that very much as background, it would seem circumstantially that ISIS, like Al-Qaeda in many ways before it, received substantial funding from Saudi sources. Now that's a lot of funding, again, to channel around the world, a 1 billion budget per year, even though when their conquests began being successful, they were able to loot the banks of the conquered cities, able to levy their own tax system, things of that sort. But even so, to garner international support, there still had to be movement of money, and people have still found it very difficult to trace the exact movement of money, how it was finessed, how it was conducted. So what I'm trying to say is that there was a very great deal of sophistication at work here, both in the insurrection itself, militarily, a great deal of sophistication in terms of the financing, in terms of the resourcing and the equipping. And the question that one asks is that with all of this, why does no one wish to accredit sophistication to the way of thinking behind the insurrection? So that's what I tried to do in the book Spear to the West. I tried to do this by two means. First of all, by investigating the electronic dissemination of information. At its height, ISIS was basically producing several hundreds videos every single year to a very high standard. Fewer now, and not always to the same high standard, because you need studios and you need cities in which studios are located to churn out videos of this nature, recording their victories, of course, so it seemed as if victory rode with the Islamic jihadists, and it seemed as if they were blessed by God. And the claim in the videos was very, very much that this was holy jihad. I'll come to a discussion about the meaning of jihad in due course. Blessed by God, mandated by God, mandated by the teachings of the scriptures, and also something which was inherent in the teachings of the great Islamic thinkers throughout Islamic history. It is thought that one of the key influences on Wahhab was a gentleman called Ibn Taymiyyah, who lived from 1263 to 1328. And he was a resident of Damascus at the time when Damascus and that area of the Middle East was under threat from the Mongol hordes. so-called. The Mongols have their own sense of justification and philosophy too, thank you very much. But the resistance involved people like Tamir, even though he was an extremely controversial thinker, but because of a very highly educated background, he was part of the Damascene negotiating parties sent out to negotiate with the Mongols. When that failed, then part of the underground resistance, and then part finally of the overground onslaught in fields of battle that finally helped to drive the Mongols out. Although the Mongols retreated on both the European and Middle Eastern fronts because of dire necessity back home. But really, quite apart from himself, therefore, being a warrior, the idea of his being a negotiator was because of his learned status, albeit extremely controversial. He wrote hundreds of books in his time. He sought out learning even from female teachers in Damascus. He had very controversial views, so he was often tried for blasphemy. And in these trials, judges from as far away as India would be brought to what we now call Syria, so there would be an objective judging panel. He spent years in prison as a result. He had a strange ecumenical sense. He actually wrote a book on Jesus, an approving book. He actually appreciated the message of Christ. But above all, he raised the standard of Islam. And it was a very pure form of Islam. And don't forget that the Mongols were themselves Islamic. So it was Islam on Islam. And of course, it wasn't the Damascenes who really gave the greatest defeats to the Mongols in that part of the world. It was the Egyptians. And that again was Islam upon Islam. The problem, quote unquote, was that the Mongols, while being Islamic, did not follow the Sharia. They were inclined to follow their own laws. Therefore, they could not be considered full Islamic believers. You can't simply follow the Quran without following both the Hadith and the Sharia. So the idea of partiality as opposed to fullness in Islamic belief was something which was very, very much emanating from a very early stage of Islamic jurisdiction over countries in the Middle East. And the idea of seeking a purity, seeking to incorporate a whole range of belief. Now, you would think that was something very difficult to put into videos, something very difficult to mount online. And what I've tried to do in the book is to trace back how it was done, not only in the videos, but online. And a very sophisticated click-through process using keywords, and each site, which is a legal above-ground site, leads you to another site, clicks through to another site, clicks through to another site, until your search history, of course, gives you away as someone who is interested in things like, for instance, jihad. In the use of keywords, a huge number of click-throughs on jihad in the West, Europe, the United States, very little click-through on that word in the Middle Eastern countries. Everyone is more familiar with that word. But if you were a Western browser constantly clicking through on sites and prioritizing words, there's a whole range of words that were keywords, but words like jihad, your, as it were, cookies would eventually lead to a recognition that you are deeply interested in a phenomenon to do with Islamic rebellion in the world, and you would start receiving phone calls to see the extent of your belief, and then be taken, if you were, as it were, a likely acolyte, through portals that would open up the dark web, where there would be more intense discussion of a theological sort. And the process is very, very much like conversion. So if you're marrying a Catholic, for instance, and it's important that both husband and wife are Catholic, then the Catholic Church has a protocol by which the unbeliever is taken into the church by means of learned conversion. The same also happens in certain forms of Jewish marriage, where a Jewish person is marrying a non-Jewish person. So this accommodation into belief is done by sophisticated pedagogical doctrinal means, step by step by step. Of course, it's all slanted towards making of you not only a believer, but an activist, and not only an activist, but preferably one prepared to be deontological, that is, to sacrifice your own well-being for the propagation of what you now know to be the true faith, even if it means attacking unbelievers. So the drawing of a distinction between the pure Islamic world and those who were apostate, that was something which was very, very key. And it seems that the effort of ISIS in forming a caliphate in the first instance was to form the nucleus of a pure Islamic world in geographical and geopolitical terms, something separated from the world. The aim was not, it would seem, in the first instance, to wage jihad against the world. And in this, it's probably not unlike some part of the early vision of Osama bin Laden. Very shortly after the attack on New York, the attack on the Twin Towers, when the United States was still reeling in 2001, Osama bin Laden released in 2002 the Letter to America. Now, it's a curious letter. It's actually in three parts. The first part has all of the protocol that is required at the beginning of a sermon in a mosque. And you've got to go through certain ritualistic protocols, almost as it were to give veracity to the preacher who knows the protocol, therefore knows what he's going to preach in terms of its substance and doctrine after the protocols. Then there's a condemnation of the United States for its international adventurism, and basically also saying, don't accuse us of atrocities when your international atrocities are so great. Almost, as it were, a childlike rhetoric, you're just as bad as me, therefore I don't have to listen to your criticism, something which every single child tries to use at some point in time, but that still, as it were, eludes the need for you to answer to your own atrocities or the things that you yourself did wrong, which may still be wrong, even if someone else is worse. So that basically is a second section, a critique of the United States. But thirdly, there's an agenda. And the agenda is basically leave us alone. Let us carve out our own geopolitical entity in the Middle East. One of the ways in which we wish to do this, which requires your cooperation, is the overthrow of unjust rulers in the Middle East. This echoes very much the Wahhabi desire in the siege of Mecca, so that had not yet disappeared. And after we overthrow these unrighteous rulers and establish a righteous rule, Osama didn't use the term caliphate like ISIS did, then we wish to be able to be treated equally in international relations and renegotiate the price of oil. So finally it came down to an amazingly modern vision of international relations, albeit with all kinds of localized, regional, and domestic consequences and radical changes. And the idea was for a just regime. Now it seems that what ISIS was trying to do, in the conquest particularly of Iraq, was to establish exactly that kind of just regime, albeit they went about it in a totally appalling way. There was a rudimentary public administration, tax collection system. As I said, Saudi school books were used. The universities continued functioning, albeit heavily policed. The banking system had to continue, but now this was in ISIS hands, the oil fields had to continue operating. Those too were in ISIS hands, and both the banks and the oil fields were sources of income, and finance had to be transacted perhaps on an underground basis, but along modern lines. Purchases had to be made along modern lines, and all of that was in ISIS hands. So that kind of public administrative capacity was very much present. And tracing back their rationales to a particular view of doctrine involved, of course, all kinds of discussions about the meaning, the nature of meaning of the great Islamic thinkers. I've itemized a number of these in my book, Spear to the West. Also involved, of course, a debate on the meaning of jihad. Now, polite Islamic society, particularly in the West, says that there are in fact two forms of jihad, a greater jihad and a lesser jihad, and that the truer meaning of both forms of jihad is the striving for excellence, whether on a personal basis or on a mass public basis. This is fine and well and good, but it tends to elude the long association of jihad, in fact, with militancy. And the step from militancy to militarized jihad was one always waiting to happen. And of course, it happened in the latter part of the 20th century and the early part of the 21st century, by which stage militarization had itself taken on extremely sophisticated forms. So you had the sense of a modernity in terms of jihad itself having to have modern characteristics, particularly if militarized. Modern in terms of communication and in terms of methodology in imparting doctrine for a modern age. Modernity in terms of rendering the thought of thinkers from the past into modern terms, urged on indeed by the urgency of modern times, set against the evilness of Western policy, particularly towards the Middle East, and the dependence on the West by rulers in the Middle East for their longevity and for their opulence. A certain, as it were, sense of the equal distribution of wealth was involved. The word socialist was never used, but certainly in Osama's vision, in terms of the just distribution of the proceeds of oil, that was very much resonant also in terms of the vision of ISIS that eventually there should be a society in which there was greater material equality. That never came about, of course, because it was defeated. Now, there were battlegrounds that were spectacular. The siege of Mosul brought in all kinds of actors. The Turks bombarded the outskirts of Mosul. The border was nearby. NATO forces bombarded from the air the university in Mosul because they thought the university was being used by ISIS to manufacture chemical weapons. And what had been a beautiful university was left in ruins. The university, all the same, became the avenue of escape for those trying to flee from Mosul underneath ISIS. Pressing against the northern fronts of Mosul were the Kurds, the Peshmerga, with female regiments very much in the front line. And basically from the southern front, no Iraqi armed force could break through until finally their crack special forces, the Golden Brigade, succeeded in breaking through. But all of these actors were there to spoil the action for each other. The Turks to spoil the action for the Peshmerga. They didn't want the Kurds having too great a victory, wanted to delay them. And the artillery bombardment was as much against them as against ISIS. They give room give time to the Golden Brigade to make progress from the south, which, to be fair, was stoutly defended by ISIS outposts. And of course, it was a declaration of Turkish geopolitical interest, strategic interest. Underneath the Ottoman Empire, Mosul had been part of the Ottoman Empire and regarded as part of an intrinsic part of what we now call Turkey, which had to be sacrificed in the compromises that Ataturk had to make with the Western powers. So all kinds of messy agendas began getting in the way there, including the agenda of female emancipation on the part of the female fighters of the Peshmerga. And the capture and the defeat of ISIS meant a consolidation of sorts on the part of the Iraqi government of territory that had been taken away from them. But it also meant a defeat of the agenda of the Kurds, further defeated now by being abandoned by the West in the Syrian front. And basically, you had finally a war of realpolitik, notwithstanding the fact that one of the key actors in this world of realpolitik claimed to be a theological state. With its defeat, of course, what you have is it's becoming pretty much like an Al-Qaeda variant, waging by cells, organized cells around the world, insurrection. As far away as Mozambique now, in different parts of Africa, such as Nigeria, Boko Haram has claimed allegiance. There's some evidence of a close link with Al-Shabaab in Somalia, and with insurrectionary groups in other parts of the world, and particularly in terms of the lone wolf attackers in Western cities in France, in Germany, and of course here in Great Britain. All driven by the sense of being converted, of the deontological need for action and self-sacrifice, and the need to sacrifice others, even children attending a rock concert, in order to proclaim the wickedness of the West and the advent of a new world order, which would be just. Which, of course, raises all kinds of questions as to justice in the final aims and objectives, and justice in the conduct of your campaign to attain those aims and objectives. Basically, as a caliphate, there's no longer, as it were, any such thing for ISIS. There's no longer that kind of geographical center. There's this kind of fragmentation, which has taken it, as I said, like Al-Qaeda, around the world. Its online work, its videoing message has been much diminished because of the lack of studios. It's still there. Its cyber capacity is very, very significant. It's got hacking capacities. So these hacking capacities are probably aided and abetted by certain Middle Eastern states. So it's not just, as it were, a cyber war that's developing now between the United States and China, with Russia, and with North Korea and Iran, are very much involved in the frame, but principally between the big three, United States, China, Russia. But other players of a non-state sort, albeit with different state supporting mechanisms, and Islamic State would be one of those players seeking to hack into the military and financial systems of the Western Hemisphere. So let us say the virtual caliphate, although reduced, is still there. And the theology is still there. What this has done has been, however, to engender a debate in the Islamic world as to the nature of Islamic theology. Can it be a simple Wahhabism, or does even, let us say, Salafist, Wahhabi, they're slightly different, antiquarian, we might call them fundamentalist beliefs, have to move with the times? What kind of modern world must we seek to accommodate? And this modern world is to an extent inescapable. You have to use its resources, its equipment, and its finance, for instance, in order to mount insurrection? Is it a modern world which can be accommodated in certain social terms as well? Is the very small, light, gradual lightening up in Saudi Arabia coming with the agreement of the Saudi Wahhabist clerical underground establishment, for instance? What kind of world would have been possible in Egypt if President Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood had been allowed by the military rulers to stay in power? What kind of links would that have had with the Saudis, with Islamic State? Close underground connections, certainly, but Egypt is in many ways an incredibly modern country. Would that have infused the rest of the Salafist, Wahhabist world? So you have there all kinds of open questions. And the work of the Egyptian thinker, al-Qaradawi, has always been of great influence and interest to me. Now, he was pretty much along the mainline thinkers of what we would call a certain fundamentalism in his late age, and it's a pity he can't get out and preach anymore. He's actually pretty much persona non grata even in Egypt. He, I think, is a professor at one of the universities in Qatar right now, and I'm certainly going to try on one of my future visits to Qatar to seek him out. Whether he would receive me is another question entirely. He has written huge books, and his most famous works until recently were to do with the need for charity. In other words, you can't be a true believer unless you give to the poor. He viewed this as a fundamental requirement of a righteous believer and as a fundamental ingredient of a just Islamic government. In other words, what you have there are the seeds of thought for a welfare state, that the poor must be accommodated in terms of the distribution of resources. But of late, he's also moved very slowly, hesitantly, towards a more, as it were, accommodating view of the rights of women. We certainly wouldn't call it a feminism. There's certainly a long way off the repression of women, certain minor freedoms. And this is apparent in one or two of the jurisdictions of the Middle East, particularly in the Gulf Arab states. I'm mindful of my visits to Qatar, where there are female deputy ministers, at least, albeit that they come from noble families. So you have a class problem, and not just a gender problem. All these things conflated in a very, very rich country, which is finally beginning to have peace talks with Saudi Arabia after their quarrel of 4 years ago, with which I had to become involved. So you have very, very much the beginnings of a sense of opening up. Al-Qaradawi himself has moved towards an accommodation, as I said, of certain limited claims to female freedoms, even a certain edging towards an accommodation with homosexuality, even an accommodation of alcohol. So in those social terms, he's moved, on his grounds, a long way. But he has made a commentary on the nature of jihad. Can it be justified as militarized waging of war against the West or against those who are Islamic but less holy in certain Islamic terms? Can you justify that kind of jihad in terms of the surah, the verses of the Quran? And his argument is sixfold as a refutation of the claims of ISIS and its preachers. Sixfold, and you'll find these on page 33 of The Spear to the West. I've tried to make a summary of these. Please don't try to read his books. They go on forever and ever over several volumes. Here's the summary. Number one, there are far too many verses of peace and forbearance. And if you're going to disregard them, if you're going to abrogate them by preferring what are called the sword surah, that is, the verses that claim it is right and righteous to wage war against the infidel, then what you have is a weighting of a far greater number of surah of peace and forbearance. The balance is against the sword surah. Number two, not only that, but if you do try to abrogate the surah of peace, then you have to do this in dispute, proper theological dispute. You just can't wave your hand and say they are wrong. You have to engage in dispute, and if dispute is unresolved, this means that the sword verses cannot be regarded as absolute. They're still underneath debate. The sword verses are not apoditic. That is, they are not yet established beyond dispute. Number three, in any case, the sword surah and those like it are all contained within historical contexts that are not transferable to other eras and to the modern world. Now, in fact, it was very important for him to say that because part of the videoing messaging of ISIS has been the reconstruction of the great battles that established the early formation of Islam as a territorial force, and of course in the battles against the Mongol hordes. And these were meant to be, as it were, metaphorical battles that could be transferred from history in metaphorical terms to animate and to inspire the battles of today. Well, basically, you can't do that, according to Al-Qaradawi. Number four, one must also consider the question of exigency. The sword verses require too much of Muslims. What? You're going to be a perpetual war with everything in the West until the West is destroyed? How are you going to do this? How, particularly if you're living in the West, going to be engaged in perpetual war with all that is around you? If there's no hardship in religion required by God, then this is certainly hardship to be in a perpetual state of war, both personally in your lesser jihad and at large in your greater jihad. Exigency acts against such an interpretation. Fifthly, therefore, the sword verses cannot serve the purposes of a peaceful world. It cannot serve the purposes of coexistence, human interaction, or any kind of true cosmopolitanism. And indeed, if there's so much Islam upon Islam firefighting in the world today, fights within the Islamic world, Boko Haram, for instance, fights against the northern Nigerian states, which are Islamic. Al-Shabaab fights against what passes as the Somali state, which is Islamic. The depredations of the ISIS affiliates in Mozambique are against a local seaboard Islamic population. So if you cannot even be cosmopolitan within your own Islamic world, and never mind the disputes between Sunni and Shia, and that was where Qatar got caught up in the crossfire, then what about the necessarily cosmopolitan nature of the world at large? Is there not going to be any kind of intercourse at all with that larger outside world? Is there not going to be, like in the glorious history of Istanbul, Constantinople, Byzantium, that city of confluences where in the cosmopolitan history of that city you had once the world's greatest coexistence of the great religions of the Middle East and the Western Hemisphere, Christians, Islamic believers, Jewish people, living, sometimes uneasily perhaps, but always somehow side by side for hundreds of years. A peaceful coexistence, and that's not served by the sword verses. So finally, number 6, the accumulated weight of Islamic scholarship over hundreds of years speaks for the claims of peaceful relations in the first instance over those of jihad. In other words, what he's tried to do in terms of scriptural and theological argument, by recourse both to the surah and also to the weight of scholarship, is to say that the ISIS believers have got a very partial, distorted, and unbalanced case, and that a true balance would prefer a peaceful, negotiated coexistence within a cosmopolitan world. And that struck me in personal terms as resonant from my early discussions with Altaf Gohar, who introduced me to the Islamic scriptures back in the late 1970s. I think I've said to you that he came as a refugee, a political refugee from Pakistan, where the only reading material he was allowed in his solitary confinement in prison was a copy of the Quran. Altaf was extremely well educated and a multilinguist, and he translated it into English, and he would take me through some of his translations. And there is a surah that says, and it's normally translated, I have chosen you, and it's the Islamic people, I have chosen you as a people most righteous. Some translations have it, I have chosen you as a people most just. Now, Altaf's translation, and this really struck me, has it as, I have chosen you as a people most balanced. And I asked Altaf, why this choice of term, most balanced? And he said, well, look, it's like the scales of justice. You achieve justice, you can call yourself just if first all of the evidence has been weighed in the scales of justice. The balance has got to be tested in the first instance. I've chosen you as a people most balanced also means that you're a just people able to live in a just peace with others. So it's been part of the discourse for many years in the Islamic community. The discourse led by somewhat controversial but Western-based intellectuals like Tariq Ramadan, who in his work, and he's controversial because he's a descendant of the founders of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, that hasn't stopped him holding chairs in Oxford, Geneva, and in the Netherlands, propagating and teaching a blend between Islam and Western thought. And he's had a lot of legal troubles in France lately. He's been accused, and it seems that these were setups as part of the Me Too phenomenon of harassing and sexually abusing female followers. It now seems that there was very, very little foundation to these claims, but the courts have yet to finally decide a final verdict in that case. So he's been out of action for a little while. He's been held in prison for a lot of this time. But in his days of liberty, he and I got on very well. I certainly didn't agree with him over everything. But he had daughters, and one of them was working at SOAS in the student union shop. Those of you who have not yet set foot in SOAS because of COVID, there is a student union shop that sells all kinds of things, including cheap newspapers, for those of you who still read newspapers. And she was studying at SOAS, and I was joking with Tariq and saying, what's the big problem about bringing up daughters in this modern world? And he just laughed and said, Stephen, in our household, I've got to listen to chemical hip-hop day and night. And he laughed at himself. He was laughing at the accommodations that had to be involved in leading or attempting to lead a cosmopolitan life. This becomes the challenge today within Islam. Is it something which can be easily refuted by simply laying claim to the sword surah for a certain form of militant militarized and atrocious jihad, or the Surah of peace, forbearance, and peace and coexistence, which necessarily bespeak a cosmopolitan world. The way forward is by a debate which is engaged but serious and deep on both sides of this debate, and trying to, as it were, abolish thought from even an atrocious organization like ISIS. That attempt at abolition is not going to make the problem any better. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.